Economic freedom matters for development and human progress. And we at the Free Market Foundation have been collaborating with our partners in Canada, the Fraser Institute, for many years on the Economic Freedom of the World report. The latest edition of the report is out now. You can find a link to that in the description below. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Bob Lawson. He is with the Cox School of Business at SMU in Dallas, Texas. He's an academic, but also a fellow of the Fraser Institute and somebody who's been intimately involved with the production of the EFW for many, many years now. Bob, welcome to the Free Market Foundation.
Thanks for having me, David.
Yeah, so maybe let's start with the basics, the first principles. Could you tell us about the Economic Freedom of the World report? What are some of its origins? Maybe touch a little bit on the methodology and why you think it's an important contributor to the public policy debate worldwide around economic policy choices.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about whether we should have a more economically free or capitalist system. And a lot of that debate's kind of hotly ideological. You have socialists on the one hand and capitalists on the other hand, and various degrees in between. But one of the things that some scholars, before my time really, this goes back to the 1980s, but some scholars notices the utter lack of empirical data in that debate. It was very ideological, but it wasn't very empirical. And so a project got started, which evolved into this Economic Freedom of the World, EFW report, and an index. And so what we try to do is measure the degree to which countries are following sort of the capitalist recipe, or alternatively, I guess, the socialist recipe, and try to put a number on it. And hopefully, if we can measure this thing, we've been debating about this, if we can measure economic freedom or capitalism, maybe we can address some of these concerns that people have about capitalism. Does it create more growth or less growth? Does it create inequality or less inequality, and so forth? Can we address these with empirical evidence as opposed to just, screaming and yelling at each other as ideologues, which is, frankly, what's happened for most of the last 200 years.
Yeah, I mean, we are unashamed ideologues, but I think having the empirical data to back up your arguments is very useful. And it's also interesting to compare different countries and to aggregate some of their policy choices and to see what kinds of patterns emerge. All right, so the methodology, let's maybe delve into that a little bit more. There are 165 countries that are ranked from the most economically free to the least economically free. There's 5 subcategories which form part of this composite index. There's the size of government, legal system and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, and then regulation. So maybe talk us through how those fit together. Are there any particular weightings? Why those categories? And what do they say about how we assess and understand economic freedom as a concept?
Sure. Let's get to first principles. Jim Gortney, who was my mentor and founded the project with me as an author, he just died last year, but he's an American. I'm an American. When we started this project, I was 21 years old. So we knew that we didn't know a lot about the world. And half the countries in this index, at least back then, I couldn't place on a map, right? So we decided that we were going to use hard data that we could find published by reputable sources, the World Bank, IMF, United Nations, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and so forth. And we were going to aggregate the data that we acquired from other people. So first of all, the methodology-wise, the index is a very data-driven index. It's not my opinion. It's not a public opinion poll or a survey or anything like that. It's driven by actual data on tax rates, on monetary policy, tariff rates, and so forth. So as you mentioned, we have the 5 areas, and within those areas, there are individual components, different pieces of data that we gather from these various sources. The weighting scheme is pretty much averages. We have experimented in years past with different alternate weighting schemes, but we've sort of settled on simple averages. They're easy to explain. Everyone understands how averages are calculated. And the good news is it turns out that the overall ratings that we end up getting at the end of the day aren't terribly sensitive to weighting schemes. So rather than complicate matters, we stick with simple averages. So we have 5 areas. Each area is 20%. Within the areas, if there's 5 variables, then each one would have 20% of that area, and so forth. But it's data driven. That's for me the most important methodological point is that I'm not sitting in my office in Dallas, Texas, sort of, putting my finger to the wind. And I think, Congo's better this year, or, Myanmar is worse this year. We're not doing that. We're just gathering the data on these types of policies. And we put them in the computer. It's very mechanical. We turn the crank and numbers kind of come out the other side.
And roughly how many data points are you putting into your?
That's a more difficult question than you might imagine. We have 42 components within those 5 areas. So area 1, for example, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It was 42 in total. But some of those actually have 3 or 4 numbers underneath them. So I've actually never done a proper count. It's probably 70 different pieces of data that we use from different sources. But 42 is kind of the headline number, and then the 5 areas. So it's much bigger than it was when we started. I mean, I think the very, very first proto index that we created in 1992, before we even published the index, I think we had 11 variables or something. So we've expanded the scope of data dramatically as more data became available. We were willing to integrate it into the index.
All right, and let's maybe delve into some of the results, Bob. I mean, what were some of the high-level trends that you picked up this year? What are some of the notable? Also, if you had to aggregate freedom globally, which way is the world getting more free or less free?
That was an easier question until COVID. Generally speaking, the world has gotten more free. We have data back to 1970 for many countries. So we actually have a pretty good time series back in time. And you'll see, in the 70s was the period of hyperinflation in many countries. It was when industrial planning and socialism was much more of a viable, alternative. But, the 80s and the 90s, if you don't like it, you'll call it neoliberalism. But the 80s and 90s was the era, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. It was an era of privatization. It was an era of lower tariffs and reductions in marginal tax rates and so forth. So the world's gotten freer beginning in the 80s through the 90s, and really all the way up until 2000. Although I will say after 2000, it's slowed down, but the global average was still increasing in the 2000s, 2010s. Since COVID was a punch in the face for the index. The global policy response to COVID was to spend a lot of money, and that's bad for economic freedom. It's they borrowed and spent a ton of money. They restricted our travel freedom, which is a variable in the index, not a big variable, but it's a variable. And then they printed a lot of money, and we're now globally we're seeing sort of the results of that loosening up of monetary policy and the ensuing inflation. So, we erased about a decade's worth of growth during COVID, and we really haven't rebounded. The data that we just released, we saw a big drop from 2000, 2001, 2002. The numbers we just released are only for 2003. We're kind of a 2-year lag on our data.
2023, obviously. Yeah.
So we haven't rebounded at all. I'm hopeful we will rebound, but generally it's higher. What you think has happened in the last 30 years in most countries has happened. A movement towards capitalism, a movement slightly away from socialism, and that's happened in almost all countries except for mine. The U.S. is actually one of the few countries that's decreased its economic freedom a little bit, but.
Okay, yeah, maybe we can unpack that a bit more. But in terms of the top 10 most free countries, we've got Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, United States, Ireland, Australia, Taiwan, Denmark, and Netherlands. Has there been much change at the top there?
Not a lot. One thing is the U.S. The U.S. historically was third. It was always Hong Kong, Singapore, U.S. It was like 1, 2, 3. You could pretty much book that. And then in the 2000s, as the U.S. began to spend more money, the wars on terrorism, the war, all this stuff, all that associated with the U.S. Policy changes in the 2000s, we've gone down to 5th. But yeah, it's pretty stable up there at the top. I mean, one of the things we've learned is that the so-called social democrat, I mean, some people call Denmark a socialist country, and that's just, our data don't show that. I mean, our data show, I mean, they have some high taxes, but outside of the tax realm, Denmark has excellent economic freedom. They got good property rights, stable monetary policy. They're very open to trade. The regulations even aren't the worst in the world by any stretch. So one of the things we've learned from the index is to take a little easy on the sort of Northern European social democracies, social welfare states. They're not really socialist, or at least not nearly as much as we thought.
I guess the premise underpinning those systems is ultimately that you need to generate value through production, through economic production, and that requires economic freedom. And maybe they're making choices around extensive welfare protections and some large state interventions, but mostly they are free economies.
That's right. I mean, the reality is there's no country that's a perfect representation of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations are out there. All countries intervene in the economy in degrees. Even Hong Kong, the highest rated country, we take special care this year in the report to mention Hong Kong. We've been mentioning it every year, really, because their economic freedom is going down. They're still ranked first, but the rating is actually falling. And anyone who's followed Hong Kong knows that the crackdown from Beijing is it's not just a political crackdown. It's also, it has economic overtones. And so Hong Kong has gone down, but it's an interventionist economy. We're grading on the curve, to talk like a professor here. We're not, you don't have to be a perfect representation of capitalism to get a good score in this index.
Yeah, well, that certainly helps. But I mean, I think it is worth remembering that countries like Singapore, like Hong Kong, were once complete backwaters. They've maybe benefited to some degree from geographic proximity or inheriting certain institutions from the colonial period and so on. But ultimately, what guided their economic development was unbridled economic freedom, free market incentives, the profit motive, banking institutions that are independent, and so on. So the same story with places like Ireland, which, I mean, 100 years ago would have been synonymous with poverty, but is today one of the most prosperous countries in the world in GDP per capita terms.
Indeed. I mean, also New Zealand. I mean, if you're my age, you can remember when New Zealand was a basket case. And I mean, it's not the richest place in the world, but it's far from the poorest, and it's actually doing quite well economically over time. But it was a laughingstock. Ireland was too. So a lot of the countries that score well on the index today, in my lifetime, were considered backwaters indeed, and they've moved towards economic freedom. They're nearly the top of our scale now, and when you think of these economies today, you think of pretty dynamic, market economies that are fairly prosperous.
All right, so those are the A students, the top of the class. But let's look at the F students, the ones that are not doing so well. So the bottom 10, we have Venezuela, Zimbabwe. This is going up in reverse chronological order. That's our northerly neighbor, Zim. Sudan, Algeria, Iran, Myanmar, Argentina, Syria, Libya, and Chad. A few African countries there. Surprised to see Argentina there as sixth from the bottom, notwithstanding some of the radical liberalization that's been happening under President Milei. I suppose this is 2023 data, so maybe that was the lag effect of Peronism. But no surprises with Venezuela and Zimbabwe. I mean, specifically on the legal system and property rights, both of those countries have really undermined the independence of the judiciary and have systematically deprived their citizenry of private property rights. What are some of your thoughts on the bottom of the freedom score there?
Yeah, I mean, it's no great surprise that when you look at that list, and Argentina doesn't surprise me either, although I'm really hopeful. I'm really looking forward to seeing the numbers in the next few years as we finally get them in for Milei. Venezuela is a tragic case because if you go back in time, Venezuela at one point would have been nearly the highest rated Latin American country in economic freedom. Again, it wasn't the richest country in the world, but it was considered a pretty high performing South American nation. And of course, it's, we all know what's gone on there. I should mention we don't rate North Korea and Cuba for lack of data. Again, that data-driven aspect of our index means we can't rate some countries that just don't have the data. So there are countries worse than 165. They're just not in the index. Yeah, but if you look at it, it is the property rights and rule of law area that really stands out for all of these countries. I mean, the absolute complete corruption of private property, corrupt judges and all of that, and it almost doesn't matter how good your monetary policy or your trade policy is if you've got a property right regime that is ruinous. But it's also true that Zimbabwe is famous for its monetary mischief. These countries are trying to have sort of tax rates that are akin to Denmark and Sweden, and yet they don't have any money. Like you mentioned, it's easy. It's one thing to spend a lot of money if you have money, but if you don't have money, it's a whole different challenge. So these countries are pretty much bad across the board. Pretty stable down there too. Venezuela is the one country that was high and has fallen, but otherwise it's pretty much the same group of 10 or 20 countries at the bottom.
Yeah, and of course, many countries that aren't able to fund their expansive programs through tax revenue are likely to go to the capital markets and indulge in extensive borrowing. Have you seen this kind of rising trend of fiscal dominance, of a lot of pressure being brought to bear on central banks, particularly since the global financial crisis? And how does that reflect in the index?
I think that's precisely the case in Argentina, and I don't know enough about Zimbabwe to say, but I'm sure I bet it's the case there. These are governments that want to deliver goodies to people. But they don't have any money, so they go to the capital markets. They borrow that money, but then they can't pay it back, so they print more. They just print it and they monetize that debt, which results in the inflations that we've seen in these countries. So yeah, that's a very common thing. But the root cause indeed is that the politicians in Buenos Aires are trying to buy votes or trying to buy supporters, and they do that by distributing funds, and then they got to figure out where to get those funds. And ultimately, the printing press seems to be the way they choose to do it. It's destructive to the entire economy, but it's good politics, I guess. But it's terrible economics.
Right, and we've touched on various themes that sort of cuts through the index, but freedom to trade. Why is that important? We're seeing protectionism rising across the world, not just in the United States under the Trump administration, but a lot of retaliatory measures, the Chinese as well. How do you see this playing out in the data, bearing in mind that there is a lag effect, that this is 2023 data? Do you see a kind of closing up of the world and maybe a complacency when it comes to the benefits of free trade?
Well, if you do look over time, it is the area, the trade area, that has seen like the biggest growth. The biggest improvements. The world has moved dramatically towards freer trade, and the volume of trade has responded accordingly. Globalization is the thing. But it's quite worrisome right now, led by the United States, to see a reversal in that. I'm generally extremely reluctant to project or predict the future with the index. I tend to sit here in my office and wait for the data to come to me rather than try to make predictions. But the tariff data that we're getting from the Trump administration do map well onto the index. So I can put in prospectively, I can put in what today's tariffs, of course, tomorrow's will be different, how it's going. But I could put in today's tariffs into my computer and say, well, what would the United States rating be? And we have a special chapter in the most recent report that sort of takes that hypothetical and says, okay, what's going to happen to the U.S.? And it's pretty bad. In the tariff area, the United States tariff rating, if these Trump tariffs stick, and I'm not sure they're going to stick, but if they stick, the U.S. will have the third highest tariffs in the world. I think the two countries below us are like Djibouti, and it's bad, right? So maybe it's second highest. So the U.S., which has been a global leader in movement towards freer trade, and therefore the globalization is at least in the current regime, backing off. Economists think this will make us poorer, not richer. Again, maybe it's good politics for the politicians, but it's going to make the countries that pull back from global trade are going to become poorer, not richer.
Right. And in the first few months of the Trump administration, we saw figures like Elon Musk being very involved and him pushing through Doge for the reduction in government spending, but then subsequently fell out with the administration around this big, beautiful bill, I think it was called, which was certainly big. I don't know if it was beautiful, but we like small bills. But yeah, I mean, do you see the attempts at all to rein in government spending in the United States? How do you see this playing out? Because I think we're approaching now a $36 trillion debt burden, which is going to be very hard to unwind.
No, the short answer is no. I mean, Doge was enjoyable in a sort of theatrical sense. But the reality is the fiscal problems in the United States are not driven by $500 hammers to the Pentagon. They're driven by an overspending in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are our medical and retirement programs, and that's where the money is. And this administration and the previous administration and the last 10 administrations have been utterly unwilling to do anything about that. So I consider Doge just to be theater. And at the end of the day, it's mostly failed to achieve any of its stated objectives. So yeah, I'm quite worried. The United States is a special case. The size of the United States, the fact that the dollar is a reserve, currency for the global financial system, it does give us a privileged position. But I don't think we should assume that we're immune to financial crises like we've seen in Argentina's of the world. So it's great concern. I'm really worried about it. One of the things we did this year in the index is we added interest payments to the index, which we had never had. It was, interest payments are small at most places as a share of the budget. It's a single-digit percentage, but it's gotten to be the point where in some countries, France is one of them, where the interest payments are, approaching 5, 8, 7% of the budget, which is not a small number anymore. So we've added that to the index.
Yeah, I think in South Africa, it's growing considerably. I think it's now the third highest budget item. So that's a real red flag.
Right.
But our South African audience might be wondering where South Africa features in the rankings. And we're going to leave that as a surprise. We have another video, which you can click on the link in the description below. That's an interview with our Deputy Chairman, Neil Emmerich, who's a longtime collaborator on the EFW project. And so the big reveal of South Africa's ranking will be in that video. So I encourage you to check that out. But Bob Lawson, I wanted to thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. That's really fascinating to look under the hood of how the Economic Freedom of the World report is built and what makes this engine tick. And yeah, thank you for the work that you do. I think it's really important that not only us in South Africa, but other partner organizations and economists and academics around the world can have access to this data and examine the trends and also demonstrate the causality that freedom leads to prosperity and human flourishing. So very important work that you're doing. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching this discussion with Bob Lawson of the Fraser Institute. If you would like to learn more about the EFW and the methodology behind it and where South Africa ranks on the list this year, do check out my interview with Neil Emmerich, Deputy Chairman of the Free Market Foundation. And also do check out libertyfirst.co.za. It's our policy framework, our proposals to the South African government about the economic freedom interventions that can be made to enhance individual freedom and economic prosperity in South Africa. There's a link in the description below. You can also check out the link to the full report, as well as more analysis from the Fraser team on how the EFW rankings are formulated. That's it from us at the Free Market Foundation. Until next time, stay free.